The rope burned against her wrists as 17-year-old Mercy Caldwell struggled against the oak tree. Her swollen belly made every movement painful, but fear for her unborn child kept her fighting. The men who had dragged her here were long gone, leaving only their cruel laughter echoing through the Montana wilderness. As darkness crept through the forest, she whispered a prayer to a God who seemed to have abandoned her completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't know was that her salvation would come in the form of a 7-foot giant with an axe in his hands, and a heart bigger than his massive frame. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of white pine forest as Mercy's eyes fluttered open. Her body ached from spending the night tied to the massive oak, and her baby had been restless, kicking against her ribs as if sensing her distress. The rope had rubbed her wrists raw, and dried tears stained her dirt-smudged cheeks. She had arrived in the town of Cedar Falls 3 days ago, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a small satchel containing her mother's wedding ring. The orphanage in Helena had turned her out the moment her condition became visible, and she'd been walking ever since, hoping to find work shelter, anywhere that would take in a pregnant girl with no family and no prospects. Cedar Falls had seemed promising at first. The logging town bustled with activity, and Mercy had thought surely someone would need help in a kitchen or laundry. But small towns had long memories and sharp tongues. Within hours, everyone knew about the pregnant stranger, and speculation spread like wildfire through the saloons and general stores that Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of the town's moral fiber, had been the first to confront her. "We don't want your kind here," she declared outside Patterson's general store, her voice carrying across the dusty main street. "This is a respectable community." Mercy had tried to explain that she was looking for honest work, that she would earn her keep and cause no trouble. But Adelaide's mind was made up, and where Adelaide led, the rest of Cedar Falls followed. By evening, a group of men led by Adelaide's eldest son, Theodore, had decided to take matters into their own hands. "Can't have that kind of influence on our decent folk," Theodore had announced to his companions at Murphy's saloon. At 25, he considered himself a pillar of the community, despite spending most of his inheritance on whiskey and gambling. Best to send a message before others like her start showing up. They had found Mercy sleeping in the church vestibule, where Reverend McKinney had reluctantly allowed her to rest for one night. The Reverend was a kind man, but even his compassion had limits when faced with Adelaide's wrath. Theodore and 3 other men had dragged a terrified Mercy from the church and into the forest, ignoring her pleas and tears. "This'll teach you to bring your shame to our town," Theodore had snarled as they bound her to the tree. "Maybe the wolves will have more use for you than we do." Now as the second day dawned, Mercy's throat was parched and her lips cracked. She had managed to doze fitfully during the night, but hunger gnawed at her stomach and she worried constantly about her baby. She had felt the child moving less since yesterday, and the thought that her situation might be harming her unborn son or daughter filled her with desperate urgency. The forest around her was beautiful in the morning light, but Mercy barely noticed the way the sun painted the pine needles gold, or how the birds sang their dawn chorus. Her world had narrowed to the burning in her wrists, the ache in her back, and the overwhelming need to protect the life growing inside her. She tried once more to work her hands free, twisting and pulling until fresh blood spotted the rope. Oak tree was ancient and solid, its trunk easily 4 feet across, and the men had known their knots well. Every attempt to escape only tightened her bonds and increased her pain. It was then that she heard it, the rhythmic thunk of an axe biting into wood, echoing through the forest from somewhere deeper in the wilderness. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the crash of falling timber. Mercy's heart raced. Was this her salvation or another threat? The footsteps that approached were heavy, deliberate. Branches snapped underfoot with each step, and Mercy realized that whoever was coming was enormous. When Ezra Blackwood finally emerged from the tree line, Mercy's breath caught in her throat. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broader than a doorframe and arms like tree trunks themselves. His dark hair was long and unkempt, his beard thick and wild. Scars crisscrossed his massive hands and forearms, evidence of years working with sharp tools and dangerous timber. His clothes were simple but well-made: wool trousers, leather boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days but was clean and mended. But it was his eyes that struck Mercy most. Despite his intimidating size, they held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his fearsome appearance. When he saw her tied to the tree, those eyes filled with something Mercy hadn't seen in days: genuine concern. "Lord have mercy," Ezra rumbled, his voice deep as thunder but soft with compassion. He dropped his massive double-bit axe and approached slowly, as if afraid he might frighten her further. "What kind of devils did this to you?" Mercy found she couldn't speak. After 2 days of terror and despair, the simple kindness in this giant's voice threatened to break the last of her composure. Tears began flowing again, but these were different tears of relief rather than hopelessness. Ezra knelt beside her, and even crouching, he was still at eye level. His enormous hands worked carefully at the knots, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle and dexterous. "Easy now," he murmured as she winced when the circulation returned to her hands. "You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." When the ropes fell away, Mercy's arms dropped to her sides like dead weight. She tried to stand but immediately stumbled, her legs too weak to support her after 2 days bound in place. Without hesitation, Ezra caught her, one massive arm supporting her back while the other cradled her carefully, mindful of her condition. "When did you last eat?" he asked, studying her pale, drawn face. 3 days, Mercy whispered, her voice barely audible. Ezra's jaw tightened, and for a moment, his gentle expression darkened with anger, not at her, but at whoever had done this. Then the moment passed, and his focus returned entirely to her welfare. "My cabin's not far," he said. "Can you walk if I help you?" Mercy nodded, though she wasn't certain she could manage even with assistance. Ezra retrieved his axe, shouldering it as easily as most men would carry a walking stick, then offered her his arm. She leaned heavily against him as they made their way through the forest, amazed by his steady strength and the care he took to guide her around roots and fallen branches. The cabin that emerged from the trees was larger than Mercy had expected, built from massive logs and fitted together with master craftsmanship. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and a well-tended garden grew beside a small stream. Everything about the place spoke of someone who took pride in his work and his home. "Built it myself," Ezra said, noticing her surprise. "Took the better part of 2 years, but she's solid. Won't find better construction this side of the Continental Divide." Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area nearby featuring a well-maintained cast iron stove. Simple wooden furniture filled the space, all of it built to accommodate Ezra's impressive size. The walls were lined with books, which surprised Mercy. She had never known a lumberjack who could read, let alone one who owned what appeared to be hundreds of volumes. "Sit," Ezra commanded gently, guiding her to a chair by the fireplace. "I'll get some food in you." He moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, his enormous frame somehow navigating the space without clumsiness. Soon the smell of bacon and eggs filled the cabin, along with the aroma of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Mercy watched in fascination as this giant of a man prepared her meal with the same care and precision she imagined he brought to his logging work. When he set the plate before her, Mercy's hands shook as she lifted the fork. The first bite of real food in days nearly brought fresh tears to her eyes. Ezra said nothing, but she caught him watching with satisfaction as she ate, his expression that of a man pleased to see a job well done. "Thank you," she managed between bites. "I don't know how to repay you." "No need for repayment," Ezra replied, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. "Just tell me who did this to you and why." Between mouthfuls of the best meal she'd had in weeks, Mercy told her story. She spoke of growing up in the Helena orphanage after her parents died in a typhoid outbreak, of the stern but fair woman who had run the institution until her death the previous year. The new director had been less understanding about Mercy's situation. "I made a mistake," Mercy said quietly, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have. A traveling merchant named William Hayes who promised to marry me and take me to California. He left town the next morning, and I never saw him again." Ezra's expression darkened again, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "When the orphanage turned me out, I had nowhere else to go. I thought maybe a smaller town would be more understanding, that someone might give me a chance to prove myself." She laughed bitterly. "I was wrong about Cedar Falls." "Tell me about the men who brought you to the forest," Ezra said, his voice carrying an edge that made Mercy shiver despite the warmth of the cabin. She described Theodore Whitmore and his companions, their cruel words and rougher hands. Ezra listened without interruption, but she could see his massive fists clenching and unclenching as she spoke. "They said I was a bad influence," Mercy finished. "Said they were protecting their town's virtue." "Virtue," Ezra spat, the word like poison in his mouth. "There's precious little virtue in tying a pregnant woman to a tree and leaving her to die." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Silence fell between them as Mercy finished eating. She studied her rescuer's face, trying to understand this contradiction of a man so frightening in appearance, yet so gentle in action. When she finally spoke, her voice was hesitant. "Why did you help me? You don't know anything about me. For all you know, they might have been right. About what kind of person I am." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally answered, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "I've been where you are," he said. "Maybe not exactly, but close enough. This world has a way of chewing up people who don't fit its idea of what's proper. I learned long ago that a person's worth isn't measured by what others think of them." He stood and began clearing her plate, his movements careful and deliberate. "Besides, any fool can see you're no threat to anyone. Just a girl in trouble who needed help. What do you mean you've been where I am?" Mercy asked. Ezra paused in his cleaning, considering his words. "I wasn't always living alone in the woods. Used to have a different life in a different place. But sometimes circumstances change, and you find yourself starting over whether you want to or not." He didn't elaborate, and something in his tone warned Mercy not to press. Instead, she asked, "What happens now?" "I can't go back to Cedar Falls, and I have nowhere else to go." "You'll stay here," Ezra said simply. "At least until the baby comes and you're back on your feet. After that, we'll figure something out." "I can't just impose on your kindness," Mercy protested. "You've already done more than enough." "It's not kindness," Ezra replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's practical. This cabin's too big for one person, and I'm tired of my own cooking. You can earn your keep by handling the kitchen and keeping house. I'll provide shelter and protection." Mercy studied his face, looking for signs of ulterior motives or hidden expectations. She had learned the hard way that men rarely offered help without wanting something in return. But Ezra's expression remained open and honest without a trace of the predatory gleam she had come to recognize and fear. "You're serious," she said. "You'd really let a stranger live in your home?" "You're not a stranger anymore," Ezra replied. "You're someone who needs help, and I'm someone who can provide it. Seems simple enough to me." The arrangement he proposed was more generous than Mercy had dared hope for, yet something in his straightforward manner made her believe he meant every word. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, somehow, things might work out. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, at least for now. And I'll earn my keep, I promise. I'm a good cook and I know how to manage a household." "I believe you," Ezra said. "Now you should rest. There's a spare room upstairs. It's not much, but it's clean and private." He led her up a narrow staircase to a small but comfortable room under the eaves. A simple bed with clean linens occupied most of the space, along with a washstand and a trunk for storage. A window looked out over the garden and the stream beyond. This was meant to be ... Ezra began, then stopped himself. "Well, it's yours now, for as long as you need it." Left alone, Mercy sank onto the bed and allowed herself to truly relax for the first time in days. The mattress was firm but comfortable, and the quilt smelled of lavender and pine. Through the window, she could see Ezra returning to his work. In the garden, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he tended to rows of vegetables. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby's gentle movements. "We're going to be all right," she whispered. "This Ezra, he's different. He's going to help us." As if responding to her words, the baby shifted, settling into a more comfortable position. For the first time in months, Mercy felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Outside, Ezra continued his work, but his mind wasn't entirely on the carrots and beans he was harvesting. The sight of that girl tied to the tree had awakened something in him he'd thought long buried, a protective instinct he hadn't felt since his sister Sarah had died 5 years ago. Sarah had been pregnant too, abandoned by a man who promised her the world and delivered nothing but heartache. She died in childbirth in a charity hospital in Denver, alone except for Ezra at her bedside. He'd been working the railroads then, sending every spare dollar back to help support her and the baby she carried. The baby his nephew Michael had lived just 3 days. Ezra had buried them both in a pauper's cemetery and walked away from his old life forever. He'd come to Montana to lose himself in the wilderness, to find peace in the simple rhythm of cutting timber and living off the land. But seeing Mercy bound to that tree had brought it all rushing back, the helplessness he'd felt watching his sister suffer, the rage at a world that punished women for the failures of men, the bone-deep sorrow that had driven him into isolation. This time would be different, he promised himself. This time, he was in a position to help. The weeks that followed established a routine that surprised them both with its easy comfort. Mercy proved herself an excellent cook and housekeeper, transforming Ezra's functional but cheerless cabin into something that felt like a real home. She had a talent for making simple ingredients into satisfying meals, and her presence brought warmth and life to rooms that had known only solitude. Ezra, for his part, was a considerate host and protector. He modified furniture to make it easier for Mercy to use as her pregnancy progressed, built her a comfortable chair with proper back support, and ensured the cabin stayed warm and well-stocked with supplies. When he traveled to distant towns for work, he always returned with small gifts, a jar of honey, a bolt of soft fabric, books he thought she might enjoy. They developed an unspoken understanding about boundaries and expectations. Ezra never pressed her for details about her past beyond what she chose to share, and Mercy respected his obvious desire for privacy about his own history. They were two people who had been wounded by life, finding solace in an arrangement that asked for nothing more than mutual respect and shared purpose. The baby grew stronger as Mercy regained her health and strength. Her cheeks filled out, and her eyes regained the spark that hardship had nearly extinguished. She began to laugh again, especially when Ezra would return from his logging work, covered in sawdust and pine sap, looking like some mythical forest creature rather than a man. "You're frightening," she would tease, brushing wood shavings from his massive shoulders. "No wonder the townspeople avoid you." "Let them. Ezra would reply with a grin that transformed his fierce features. "Keeps thee fools away from my door." But Mercy gradually learned that Ezra's fearsome reputation was largely undeserved. Yes, he was enormous and incredibly strong. She had watched him single-handedly move logs that would require teams of horses in other circumstances. And yes, his appearance was intimidating, especially when he emerged from the forest covered in the evidence of his labor. But he was also remarkably well-educated, with a library that would shame many university professors. In the evenings, he would read aloud while Mercy mended clothes or worked on preparations for the baby. His voice, so deep and resonant, brought poetry and literature to life in ways that made even familiar stories feel new and magical. "Where did you learn to read like that?" Mercy asked one evening as he finished a passage from Shakespeare. "My mother," Ezra replied, his expression growing distant. "She was a teacher before she married my father. Insisted that education was the only thing that could never be taken away from you. Was she right?" Ezra considered this, absently stoking the fire. "Mostly, though sometimes the things that can't be taken away become the heaviest burdens to carry." Mercy sensed there was a deeper story there, but she had learned to recognize when Ezra's past became too painful to examine. Instead, she asked about his work, a safer topic that always brightened his mood. His logging operation was unlike anything the big companies employed, where they clear-cut entire mountainsides, leaving scarred earth in their wake. Ezra practiced selective harvesting. He took only mature trees, leaving the young growth to flourish and maintaining the forest's health for future generations. "Trees aren't just timber," he explained as they walked through his working area one afternoon. "They're living things that have been growing for decades, sometimes centuries. Each one has earned the right to be treated with respect." This philosophy extended to his work methods as well. While other loggers used teams of men and heavy equipment, Ezra worked alone, using his incredible strength and skill to fell, limb, and section trees with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. He could drop 100-foot pine exactly where he wanted it, splitting it into boards and beams with precision that amazed even experienced woodsmen. His solitary methods meant he worked more slowly than the large operations, but his lumber was prized throughout Montana for its quality. Builders would wait months for Ezra Blackwood timber, knowing that his boards would be straight, strong, and perfectly seasoned. "Don't you ever get lonely, working out here by yourself?" Mercy asked as she watched him notch a massive fir with mathematical precision. "Used to," Ezra admitted, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "But loneliness is better than the wrong kind of company. And lately," he glanced at her with something that might have been affection, "lately I haven't been lonely at all." The comment made Mercy's heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. Over the weeks, she had come to see Ezra not just as her rescuer, but as something rarer, a truly good man. He was patient with her moods, understanding about her physical discomfort, and protective without being possessive. When she woke from nightmares about Theodore and his companions, Ezra would make her tea and sit with her until she felt safe enough to sleep again. But their arrangement remained strictly practical, at least on the surface. Mercy had her room, Ezra had his, and they shared the common areas like respectful housemates. Yet there were moments when their hands would brush as she served dinner, or when she would catch him watching her with unguarded tenderness that suggested deeper feelings were developing on both sides. One evening in late October, as the first snow began to dust the peaks around them, Mercy was preparing dinner when a sharp pain seized her abdomen. She gasped and gripped the edge of the kitchen table, her face going white. Ezra, who had been reading by the fire, was at her side instantly. "What is it? The baby?" "I don't know," Mercy panted as the pain subsided. It felt different from the usual kicking, sharper. Ezra's expression grew serious. "How long until the baby's due?" The midwife in Helena said sometime in December, but that was months ago. I'm not certain of the exact date. We need to be prepared, Ezra said decisively. I'll ride to Millerville tomorrow and bring back Doc Henderson. He's delivered half. The baby's in 3 counties. Can we afford a doctor? Mercy asked, worry creasing her features. Don't you concern yourself with that, Ezra replied firmly. Your job is to stay healthy and rest. Everything else is my responsibility. True to his word, Ezra departed before dawn the next morning, leaving Mercy with enough firewood, food, and water to last a week. The doctor, a grizzled old man named Henderson, who had been delivering babies since before Mercy was born, arrived that afternoon riding behind Ezra on a specially reinforced horse. After examining Mercy, Doc Henderson pronounced both mother and baby healthy, but cautioned that the birth could come sooner than expected. First babies are unpredictable, he warned. Could be next week, could be next month. Best to be ready for anything. He left detailed instructions and a bag of medical supplies, promising to return when summoned. As he prepared to leave, he pulled Ezra aside for a private conversation. That's a good girl you've got there, the doctor said quietly. Been through hell, but she's strong. The baby's positioned well, and barring complications, everything should go smoothly. Any special care she needs? Ezra asked. Just what you're already doing. Keep her fed, rested, and feeling safe. Stress is the enemy now. Henderson studied Ezra's concerned expression. You care about her. It wasn't a question, and Ezra didn't pretend otherwise. She's been through enough hardship. Deserves some peace. What about after? You thought about what happens when the baby comes? Ezra had been thinking about little else. The arrangement that had begun as temporary charity was evolving into something neither of them had planned, but both seemed to want. Yet he was acutely aware of the differences between them, not just in size and background, but in the assumptions others would make about their relationship. That's up to her, Ezra said finally. She's free to leave whenever she chooses. But if she wants to stay ... you'd make it permanent? I'd make it whatever she wanted it to be. Doc Henderson nodded approvingly. Good answer. That girl's had enough people making decisions for her. Time someone let her choose her own path. As winter tightened its grip on the Montana mountains, the cabin became a world unto itself. Snow piled high against the walls, and the forest grew, silent except for the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Ezra continued his work when weather permitted, but more often he found himself content to stay close to home, working on indoor projects and ensuring Mercy had everything she needed. Had settled into an easy domesticity that felt natural despite its unusual circumstances. Mercy managed the household with quiet efficiency, while Ezra handled the heavy work and protection from the elements. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, Ezra reading aloud while Mercy worked on baby clothes she was sewing from fabric he had brought from town. The approaching birth hung over everything like a gentle promise. They had transformed the spare room into a nursery, with a crib Ezra had crafted from cherry wood and a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. Baby clothes hung on lines near the fireplace, and supplies were carefully organized in preparation for the momentous day. Yet, neither spoke directly about the future beyond the birth. There was an unspoken understanding that everything would change once the baby arrived, but what form that change would take remained carefully unexamined. They existed in a bubble of present contentment, both perhaps afraid that planning too far ahead might somehow break the spell of their unexpected happiness. It was during one of these quiet evenings that their carefully maintained boundaries finally shifted. Mercy had been struggling with the baby clothes, her swollen fingers making the delicate stitching difficult. When she dropped her needle for the 3rd time and began to cry from frustration, Ezra moved from his chair to kneel beside her. Here, he said gently, his massive hands taking the tiny garment from her. Let me help. To Mercy's amazement, he began stitching with the same precision he brought to his woodwork, his enormous fingers managing the delicate task with unexpected skill. "Where did you learn to sew?" she asked, wiping away her tears. "Sarah," he replied quietly, "my sister. She taught me when I was young, said every man should know how to mend his own clothes. Never thought I'd be making baby things, though." They worked together in comfortable silence, and when Ezra finished the small shirt, Mercy impulsively reached out and covered his hand with hers. "Thank you," she said, "not just for this, but for everything. For saving me, for caring for me, for giving me hope when I thought I had none left." Ezra's hand turned palm up, gently enclosing her smaller one. "You saved me too," he said softly. "I just didn't realize I needed saving until you arrived." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities and growing affection. But before either could examine it too closely, Mercy felt a familiar sharp pain, stronger than before. "Oh," she breathed, her hand moving to her belly. "Another pain?" Ezra asked, immediately alert. "Yes, but different. More intense." She tried to stand and felt a rush of warm fluid down her legs. Her eyes widened in realization and fear. I think it's time." Ezra moved with controlled urgency, his massive frame suddenly graceful as purpose overtook him. Within minutes, he had prepared the bedroom with clean linens, boiled water, and retrieved Doc Henderson's medical bag from its careful storage. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the pine trees with increasing ferocity, but inside the cabin, warmth and determination prevailed. "The storm's getting worse," Mercy gasped between contractions, gripping the bedpost as another wave of pain crashed over her. "What if Doc Henderson can't make it through?" "Then we'll manage on our own," Ezra replied with quiet confidence, though privately he shared her concern. The November blizzard had arrived 3 days ahead of the weather signs he usually read, and the mountain passes would be treacherous for hours yet. Women have been having babies long before there were doctors to help them. He knelt beside the bed, his enormous hand surprisingly gentle as he helped her into a more comfortable position. Throughout the long night that followed, Ezra proved himself as capable a midwife as he was a lumberjack. He had assisted with difficult animal births on farms in his youth, and Doc Henderson's detailed instructions provided the medical knowledge he lacked. Labor progressed slowly, as first births often do. Between contractions, Mercy would doze fitfully while Ezra maintained the fire, prepared warm compresses, and quietly read medical passages by lamplight. When the pains intensified, he would return to her side, offering his hand to squeeze and speaking in the same calm, steady voice he used when gentling spooked horses. "Tell me about California," Mercy whispered during one of the quieter moments near dawn. "You mentioned you'd been there once." Ezra settled into the chair beside the bed, grateful for the distraction. "Spent a winter in the Sierra Nevada cutting timber for the railroad. Beautiful country mountains that make these look like hills, and valleys green as emeralds in springtime." He described the giant sequoias, trees so massive that tunnels could be cut through their trunks for carriages to pass. He spoke of mornings when mist rose from mountain lakes like ghostly dancers, and evenings when the sunset painted granite peaks in shades of rose and gold. His deep voice wove pictures that transported Mercy beyond the confines of pain and fear. "Maybe someday we could see it together," she said softly, then tensed as another contraction began. "Oh, this one's stronger." The sun was high overhead when Mercy's labor entered its final phase. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside draped in pristine snow, but inside the cabin, the ancient drama of birth reached its crescendo. Ezra had long since discarded his usual composure, sweat beading his forehead as he coached Mercy through each push with the intensity of a general commanding troops. "I can see the head," he announced, wonder creeping into his voice despite the circumstances. "Dark hair, lots of it." 3 more powerful contractions, and suddenly the cabin filled with the indignant cry of new life. Ezra's hands, which could split logs with surgical precision, cradled the slippery, squirming infant with infinite care. "It's a boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. "A perfect, healthy boy." The baby continued his protests as Ezra cleaned him with warm water and wrapped him in the softest blanket Mercy had prepared. When he finally placed the child in his mother's arms, the infant quieted, as if recognizing the voice and heartbeat that had been his constant companions for months. "Hello, little one," Mercy whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama." The baby opened dark eyes, startlingly alert for one so new to the world, and seemed to study her face with grave concentration. His tiny fist escaped the blanket's confines and waved briefly before finding his mouth. "What will you name him?" Ezra asked, settling carefully on the edge of the bed to get a better look at the newest member of their unusual household. Mercy considered this, studying her son's features. "Samuel," she said finally, "after my father." "Samuel David Caldwell." "Samuel David," Ezra repeated, testing the name. Strong name for a strong boy. The next few hours passed in the hazy, exhausted contentment that follows great effort successfully completed. Mercy dozed with Samuel nestled against her, while Ezra dealt with the practical matters, cleaning up, preparing food, and banking the fire for sustained warmth. When Doc Henderson finally arrived in the afternoon, having battled through snowdrifts that reached his horse's belly, he found a scene of domestic tranquility that brought a smile to his weathered face. "Well, I'll be damned," the old physician muttered, examining both mother and child with professional thoroughness. "Looks like I wasn't needed after all. This little fellow's as healthy as a horse, and his mama's doing just fine." "Ezra delivered him," Mercy said proudly. "I couldn't have managed without him." Doc Henderson glanced at the giant Lumberjack, who was modestly deflecting praise while preparing tea with domestic efficiency. "Seems to me you found yourself quite a capable partner, miss. Baby's lucky to have such attentive parents." The word parents hung in the air, unexamined but not corrected. Over the following days, as Mercy recovered and Samuel established his routine of eating and sleeping, the three of them settled into patterns that felt remarkably natural. Ezra proved unexpectedly adept at infant care, his large hands somehow perfect for supporting a tiny head or changing delicate clothes. "He likes it when you sing," Mercy observed one evening, watching Ezra pace the floor with a fussy Samuel. The giant's deep voice had been rumbling lullabies learned from his own childhood, and the baby had calmed immediately. "Sarah used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep," Ezra admitted. "Seemed worth trying. Tell me about her," Mercy said gently. "You've mentioned your sister before, but never talked about what happened to her." Ezra was quiet for so long that Mercy thought he wouldn't answer. Samuel had fallen asleep in his arms, and he settled the baby carefully in the crib before speaking. "She was 2 years younger than me, and the only family I had after our parents died. Beautiful, smart, full of dreams about seeing the world. Beyond our little farm in Kansas," his expression darkened, "she trusted the wrong man, just like you did. A railroad surveyor who promised to take her to Denver and marry her properly once his work was finished. But he didn't. No, left her with a baby coming and no way to support herself. I was working the railroads then, sending money when I could. But it wasn't enough. She died giving birth in a charity ward, and the baby lived only 3 days." Mercy's heart ached for the pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry. I buried them both and walked away from everything I'd known. Came to Montana to lose myself in the wilderness and forget that the world could be so cruel to innocent people. But then you found me." Ezra looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Or you found me. Either way, watching you with Samuel. It's like having a second chance at something I thought was lost forever." The weeks that followed established new rhythms in the mountain cabin. Samuel proved to be a remarkably easy baby content to sleep in his crib during the Day while Mercy managed household tasks, and peaceful in the evenings when the three of them would gather by the fire. Ezra had fashioned a cradle that rocked gently beside Mercy's chair, allowing her to tend the baby while knitting or mending. Winter deepened around them, but inside the cabin, warmth and contentment reigned. Ezra's logging work was necessarily limited by weather and his reluctance to leave Mercy and Samuel alone for extended periods. But his reputation for quality had grown to the point where orders backed up through the following summer. "Henderson's building a new church in Millerville," Ezra announced one evening, reading through his correspondence. "Wants enough oak boards for the entire structure. That's 3 months' work, minimum. Good money?" Mercy asked, adjusting Samuel's position as he nursed. "Very good. Enough to ... Ezra trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Enough to what? I was going to say enough to add on to the cabin. Maybe build a proper nursery, expand the kitchen. But I realize I've been making assumptions about what you want." Mercy looked up from Samuel's contented feeding, meeting Ezra's eyes directly. "What assumptions? That you'll stay. That this arrangement we've fallen into is something you want to make permanent." The question that had been lurking unspoken for months finally hung between them, demanding an answer. Mercy considered her words carefully, acutely aware that her next sentences might determine the course of 3 lives. "When I was tied to that tree, waiting to die, I prayed for salvation," she said quietly. "I thought I was asking God to save me and my baby. But I realize now that I was really asking for a home, a place where we could belong and be safe." She gestured around the cabin with her free hand. "This feels like home. You feel like the family I never thought I'd have. And Samuel adores you. He lights up when he hears your voice, reaches for you when you come in from work. In every way that matters, you're already his father." The words settled between them with the weight of truth finally acknowledged. Ezra rose from his chair and knelt beside Mercy's rocker, his enormous presence somehow comforting rather than overwhelming. "I love you," he said simply. "Both of you. I know the circumstances of how we came together weren't conventional, and I know there are those who would judge our arrangement. But I've never felt anything as strong as what I feel when I look at you holding our son." "Our son," Mercy repeated softly, testing the words. "Yes, that's exactly what he is." She reached out with her free hand to touch Ezra's bearded cheek. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to hope for something so wonderful." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a sealing of promises rather than a passionate declaration. Samuel stirred against Mercy's chest but didn't wake, as if sensing that this moment required reverence rather than interruption. When they broke apart, Ezra rested his forehead against Mercy's. "I want to marry you properly," he said. "Not because of what people will think, but because I want the whole world to know that you're mine and I'm yours." "And I want to take your name," Mercy replied. "Mercy Blackwood has a nice sound to it, don't you think? The finest sound I've ever heard." As if summoned by their declarations, Samuel chose that moment to finish nursing and look up at both of them with his dark, serious eyes. For a moment, the three of them formed a perfect tableau, the unlikely family that had emerged from tragedy and chance, bound together by love that had grown slowly but surely through the darkest months of winter. Their wedding took place in February, during a brief break in the mountain weather. Doc Henderson performed the ceremony in the cabin's main room, with Mrs. Henderson serving as witness and Samuel sleeping peacefully in his crib nearby. Mercy wore a dress of deep blue wool that Ezra had commissioned from the seamstress in Millerville, and Ezra had trimmed his wild beard to merely impressive proportions. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When Doc Henderson pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra's kiss lifted Mercy completely off her feet, though he set her down quickly, mindful of her still recovering strength. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured against her ear. "Thank you for making us a family, Mr. Blackwood," she replied. The Hendersons stayed for dinner and an evening of quiet celebration, regaling the newlyweds with stories of other couples they'd known who had found happiness in unconventional circumstances. As the evening wound down, Doc Henderson pulled Ezra aside for a private word. "You know there might be talk when word gets back to Cedar Falls," the old physician warned. "Some folks won't understand how a woman like Mercy ended up married to someone like you." "Let them talk," Ezra replied calmly. "Anyone who has a problem with my wife or my son is welcome to discuss it with me personally." Doc Henderson chuckled, imagining how such discussions might go. Few men would be brave enough to challenge Ezra Blackwood directly, and fewer still would be foolish enough to persist once they saw the gentle devotion in his eyes when he looked at his family. Spring's arrival brought new challenges and opportunities. Samuel had grown into a robust, alert infant who seemed to find endless fascination in the world around him. He would lie on a blanket near the open cabin door, watching the play of sunlight through new leaves while Mercy worked in her expanded garden and Ezra split logs nearby. The logging orders had indeed multiplied over the winter, and Ezra found himself in the enviable position of being able to choose his projects based on interest rather than desperation. He had begun taking on apprentices, young men from struggling farms who were willing to learn his conservation methods in exchange for training in high-quality timber work. "You're building an empire," Mercy teased one evening as she reviewed the books they now kept for the expanded operation. "I'm building a legacy," Ezra corrected. "Something to leave Samuel when he's old enough to decide what he wants to do with his life." Samuel, as if hearing his name, looked up from his position on the hearth rug where he had been attempting to crawl. At 4 months old, he was already showing signs of the determination and strength that ran in both sides of his adoptive heritage. The knock on their door that came in late April was unexpected and unwelcome. Ezra answered it to find Theodore Whitmore standing on his porch, flanked by 2 other men Mercy recognized as being among those who had tied her to the tree the previous fall. "Blackwood," Theodore said with false bravado, clearly nervous despite his companions. "We need to talk." "No, we don't," Ezra replied evenly, his massive frame filling the doorway. "You need to leave my property before I remove you myself. Now." "Hold on," Theodore protested. "We come in peace. Just want to clear the air about that business last fall. The business where you tied a pregnant woman to a tree and left her to die." Ezra's voice dropped to a dangerous rumble. "That business?" Mercy appeared at Ezra's shoulder, Samuel in her arms. The sight of the baby clearly thriving and healthy seemed to embarrass Theodore, as if he were confronting the consequences of his cruelty. "Look," Theodore said, shifting uncomfortably under Ezra's glare. "Maybe we were hasty. Maybe we didn't think things through properly. Maybe." Ezra stepped onto the porch, forcing the 3 men back several paces. "You tied up a pregnant girl and abandoned her in the woods. What part of that seemed reasonable at the time?" "She was a stranger, causing trouble in our town," one of Theodore's companions protested. "We were protecting our families." "From what? A girl looking for work?" Mercy moved to stand beside her husband, her chin raised defiantly. "I remember. You, Mr. Morrison, your wife runs the boarding house. I asked her for work washing linens, and she called me a whore before I even finished speaking." Morrison's face reddened, but he had no answer. The 3rd man, whom Mercy remembered as the blacksmith's son, couldn't seem to meet her eyes at all. "The point is," Theodore continued desperately, "water under the bridge. We heard she had the baby and everything worked out fine. We thought maybe she'd like to come back to town, make a proper life for herself." "She has a proper life," Ezra said quietly. "She's my wife." The silence that followed was profound. Theodore's mouth fell open, while his companions stared in shock at the massive lumberjack and the small woman beside him. "Your ... wife?" Theodore finally managed. "Mrs. Mercy Blackwood," Mercy confirmed, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "And this is our son, Samuel." The baby chose that moment to gurgle happily and reached toward Ezra, who took him with the easy competence of an experienced father. The sight of the gentle giant cradling the infant seemed to drive home the reality of the situation more than words could have. But double Theodol struggled for words. "People will talk. People always talk," Ezra replied. "The question is whether they'll do it from a safe distance or whether they'd prefer to discuss their opinions with me directly." The implied threat hung in the air like morning mist. Theodore and his companions were not small men, but standing before Ezra Blackwood, they looked like children who had awakened something far beyond their ability to handle. "We should go," Morrison muttered, already backing toward their horses. "Yes," Ezra agreed. "You should? And gentlemen? If I hear that anyone in Cedar Falls has spoken ill of my wife or son, I'll take it as a personal insult requiring personal satisfaction." The three men mounted their horses with unseemly haste and rode away without another word. Ezra and Mercy stood on their porch, watching until the riders disappeared around the bend in the forest path. "Do you think they'll cause more trouble?" Mercy asked. "Not if they have any sense," Ezra replied. "But even if they do, it doesn't matter. This is our home. You're my wife. Samuel is our son, and anyone who doesn't like it can go to hell." Mercy laughed despite her nervousness. Such language in front of the baby. "He needs to learn early that his father doesn't tolerate fools," Ezra said, bouncing Samuel gently. The baby laughed and grabbed at his father's beard, utterly untroubled by adult concerns about social conventions. That evening, as they sat by the fire with Samuel playing on a blanket between their chairs, Mercy reflected on how completely their lives had changed from that terrible night when she had been bound to the oak tree. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Ezra. "Taking us in, changing your whole life for a stranger and her baby?" Ezra considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "I regret that you suffered before you found us," he said finally. "I regret that Samuel will grow up knowing there are people cruel enough to abandon pregnant women in forests. But regret loving you? Regret having a family? Never." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. "Besides, you weren't really a stranger. You were the answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was praying." Samuel chose that moment to roll over for the first time, pushing himself up on tiny arms to survey his domain with the satisfied expression of one who had accomplished something significant. Both parents immediately began praising his achievement, their voices blending in the sort of delighted parental foolishness that has marked loving families since time immemorial. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, wild and beautiful, and sometimes dangerous. Inside the cabin, three people who had found each other against all odds continued building the life they had never dared dream possible. The future remained unwritten, full of challenges they couldn't yet imagine and joys they couldn't yet anticipate. But whatever came, they would face it together, the giant lumberjack who had learned that strength meant more than physical power, the young woman who had discovered that courage could grow from the ashes of despair, and the baby who had been born into love despite being conceived in betrayal. As the fire settled into glowing embers and Samuel finally succumbed to sleep, Ezra and Mercy shared the comfortable silence of people who had found their place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new moments of joy and worry. But tonight, in their mountain cabin surrounded by the endless forest, they were exactly where they belonged. 2 years had transformed the Blackwood family from refugees hiding in the wilderness into a force of nature that commanded respect throughout western Montana. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined chin, could often be found trailing behind Ezra through the forest, chattering in the mixture of real words and toddler babble that only his parents seemed to understand perfectly. The logging operation had expanded beyond anything Ezra had originally envisioned. What had begun as selective harvesting by a solitary giant had evolved into a revolutionary approach to sustainable forestry that attracted attention from as far away as Seattle and Denver. Ezra's apprentices, now numbering 8 young men from across 3 states, had spread word of his methods, and orders poured in faster than they could fulfill them. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you," Mercy announced one morning, reading through the latest batch of correspondence while Samuel played with wooden blocks at her feet. "Something about implementing your forestry methods on public lands." Ezra paused in sharpening his axe, considering this development. Politicians usually mean trouble, one way or another. This one seems different. "Listen to this. Mr. Blackwood's innovative approach to timber harvesting represents the future of responsible resource management. Montana Territory would benefit greatly from his expertise and guidance." Fancy words. The question is what they really want. Samuel toddled over and grabbed at his father's trouser leg, demanding attention. Ezra scooped up his son with one massive hand, settling the boy on his shoulders where Samuel immediately began pulling at his father's hair. "Papa work?" Samuel asked, his vocabulary expanding daily. "Not today, little man. Today we're going to visit Henderson Place and help with their barn raising." The barn raising had become an annual tradition, with families from miles around gathering to help each other with major construction projects. This year, it would be Ezra's first appearance at such a community event since his marriage to Mercy, and both parents were curious to see how they would be received. The ride to the Henderson farm took them through Cedar Falls, a journey they had avoided for nearly 2 years. The town had grown in their absence. New businesses lined the main street, and the population had nearly doubled as word spread about rich timber contracts in the region. As their wagon rolled down the dusty main thoroughfare, conversations stopped and heads turned. Some townspeople stared with open curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility, but all seemed transfixed by the sight of the legendary giant Lumberjack, accompanied by his small, dignified wife and their robust son. "Mama, people looking," Samuel observed with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Yes, they are," Mercy replied calmly. "But that's their business, not ours." Outside Patterson's general store, they encountered Adelaide Whitmore, now grayer and more pinched than ever. The banker's wife had been holding court with several other matrons, but fell silent as the Blackwood wagon approached. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mercy said politely, nodding from her seat beside Ezra. Adelaide's face flushed red with indignation and something that might have been shame. "I heard rumors, but I hardly believed them. How could you ... How could I what?" Mercy asked, her voice remaining level despite the anger building in her chest. "Associate yourself with such ... irregularity. That child deserves a proper father, not some wilderness savage." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Several of Adelaide's companions looked uncomfortable, clearly aware they were witnessing something that could turn dangerous very quickly. Ezra said nothing, but Samuel chose that moment to call out "Papa," with obvious delight, reaching his small arms toward the man he had never known wasn't his biological father. "That child has the finest father in Montana Territory," Mercy said firmly. "A man who saved our lives when your own son tried to murder us both." "Theodore was protecting the community," Adelaide snapped, but her protest lacked conviction. "Theodore was drunk and cruel, and you know it." Mercy's composure finally cracked slightly. "Your son tied a pregnant woman to a tree and left her to die. If you want to talk about irregularity, Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps you should examine your own family's behavior." Before Adelaide could respond, Ezra finally spoke, his voice carrying across the street despite its quiet tone. "Mrs. Whitmore, I suggest you move along. My wife has been more patient with your rudeness than you deserve." The implied threat was unmistakable, and Adelaide gathered her skirts with as much dignity as she could muster. "This isn't over," she muttered as she stalked away. "Yes, it is," Ezra replied, but she was already beyond hearing. The barn raising proceeded without further incident, though the Blackwoods remained the subject of considerable whispered speculation. Ezra's skill with heavy timber quickly won over the practical farmers who cared more about getting their barn built than about social gossip. His ability to single-handedly lift support beams that normally required 4 men made him invaluable, and his quiet competence gradually earned grudging respect even from those initially suspicious of his unconventional family. Mercy found acceptance among the other wives more slowly, but her gentle manner with their children and her obvious competence in domestic matters eventually wore down most resistance. Samuel, completely oblivious to adult prejudices, charmed everyone with his cheerful personality and obvious affection for both his parents. "That's a fine boy you've got there," commented Martha Henderson, watching Samuel share his toy blocks with her granddaughter. "Happy children come from happy homes." "He is happy," Mercy agreed. "We all are." "Shows. There's a contentment about your family that you don't see everywhere. Your husband clearly adores you both." Mercy glanced across the construction site, where Ezra was directing the placement of roof trusses. Samuel perched safely on his massive shoulders. "He saved us in more ways than one. I don't know what we would have done without him." "Sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other," Martha observed wisely. "Blood doesn't always make the strongest bonds." The conversation was interrupted by shouting from across the construction site. Theodore Whitmore had arrived with several companions, all of them clearly having fortified themselves with liquid courage before making the journey. "There he is," Theodore called out, pointing at Ezra. "The man who stole our property." A dangerous silence fell over the barn raising. Tools stopped moving, conversation ceased, and everyone turned to watch what would unfold. Ezra carefully lifted Samuel down from his shoulders, handing the boy to one of his apprentices before turning to face his accusers. "What property would that be, Whitmore?" Ezra asked conversationally. "That woman," Theodore replied, his words slightly slurred. "She was meant to be run out of town proper, not taken up by some mountain hermit. That woman is my wife, and she's never been anyone's property. She's a whore who tricked you into thinking her bastard is yours." Theodore pressed, emboldened by alcohol and the presence of his friends. "Everyone knows what she is." The change in Ezra was subtle but unmistakable. His relaxed posture straightened, his jaw set, and his eyes took on the cold intensity of a predator identifying prey. Around the construction site, wise men began backing away, creating space for what was about to unfold. "Theodore," said Doc Henderson urgently, recognizing the signs of impending violence, "you should leave now." "I ain't going nowhere until—" "I've said my piece," Theodore declared. "This man's been harboring a fallen woman and corrupting the morals of our community. Someone needs to speak up for decency." "The only indecent thing I see here," Ezra said quietly, "is a drunk coward who ties up pregnant women because he's too weak to face his own failures." Theodore's face purpled with rage. "You calling me a coward?" "I'm calling you exactly what you are. A pathetic boy playing at being a man, hiding behind his mother's skirts and his father's money." The insult was calculated to provoke, and it succeeded. Theodore lunged forward, swinging wildly at Ezra's head. The giant lumberjack caught the smaller man's fist in his enormous hand, stopping the punch as easily as he might catch a thrown apple. What followed was less a fight than a demonstration. Ezra lifted Theodore off his feet with one hand, holding him at arm's length while the banker's son flailed helplessly. When one of Theodore's companions tried to intervene, Ezra backhanded him almost casually, sending the man sprawling in the dirt. "This is what happens when boys try to play men's games," Ezra announced, his voice carrying across the entire construction site. Theodore Whitmore, You and your friends have exactly 10 seconds to mount your horses and ride away. If I see any of you near my family again, I'll take it as a declaration of war." He released Theodore, who stumbled backward and nearly fell. The banker's son's face was pale now, all bravado drained away by the reality of facing someone who could literally crush him without effort. "This isn't over," Theodore gasped, trying to salvage some dignity from his humiliation. "Yes, it is," Ezra replied calmly. "Unless you want it to continue right here, right now." Theodore and his companions fled toward their horses, mounting hastily and riding away without another word. The watching crowd began to disperse, most nodding approval at Ezra's handling of the situation. "Well," said Doc Henderson cheerfully, "now that the entertainment's over, shall we get back to building this barn?" The remainder of the barn raising proceeded without incident, though Ezra found himself the recipient of numerous quiet conversations from men who wanted to express their approval of his actions. It seemed that Theodore's bullying behavior had made him few friends even in his own town. "About time someone put that boy in his place," muttered Jim Patterson, whose general store had been the scene of some of Theodore's worst behavior. Ben, trading on his father's reputation for years, thinking it made him untouchable. "His mother won't be pleased," another farmer observed. "Adelaide Whitmore's displeasure isn't my concern," Ezra replied. "My family's safety is." As the sun set over the completed barn, the Blackwood family made their way home through the forest paths Ezra knew by heart. Samuel had fallen asleep in his mother's arms, exhausted by a day of new faces and excitement. Mercy was quiet, processing the day's events and their implications. "Do you think we've made permanent enemies?" she asked as their cabin came into view. "We already had them," Ezra pointed out. "Today just made the situation clear to everyone involved. And if they try to cause more trouble—" Ezra helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle but his expression resolute. "Then they'll discover that troubling the Blackwood family carries consequences they're not prepared to face." The threat from Cedar Falls materialized sooner than expected, but in a form none of them had anticipated. Rather than direct confrontation, Adelaide Whitmore had chosen a more insidious approach. She had written to territorial authorities, claiming that Ezra Blackwood was operating an illegal timber business and harboring criminals. The letter that arrived in late summer was official and ominous, summoning Ezra to appear before a territorial magistrate to answer charges of unlawful resource extraction and harboring fugitives. The allegations were vague but serious enough to potentially result in fines, imprisonment, or seizure of property. "Fugitives?" Mercy read aloud, her voice rising with indignation. "What fugitives?" "You, apparently," Ezra said grimly, studying the legal document. "According to this, you're wanted for vagrancy and moral corruption. That's ridiculous. I've never committed any crime." "Of course not. But Adelaide has connections, and she's found a magistrate willing to listen to her version of events." Mercy sank into her chair, Samuel playing contentedly at her feet. "What do? We go to the territorial capital and settle this once and for all. All of us, all of us, all of us. I'm not leaving you and Samuel here unprotected, and I won't face these charges without witnesses to the truth." The journey to Helena took 4 days through mountain passes already showing signs of early autumn. Ezra had converted his largest logging wagon into a mobile home, with canvas stretched over wooden ribs to create shelter and space for all their necessities. Samuel treated the expedition as a grand adventure, delighting in sleeping under the stars and discovering new wonders at every turn in the trail. Helena, territory capital, bustled with activity as autumn brought traders, ranchers, and settlers in to conduct business before winter set in. The Blackwood family attracted attention wherever they went. Ezra's imposing size, Mercy's quiet dignity, and Samuel's cheerful charm made them impossible to ignore. The territorial courthouse was an imposing brick structure that dominated the main square. Inside, Magistrate Henry Fitzpatrick presided over a courtroom filled with the curious and the concerned. Adelaide Whitmore had made the journey from Cedar Falls, accompanied by her son Theodore and several other townspeople prepared to testify against the Blackwoods. The case against Ezra Blackwood and Associates, Magistrate Fitzpatrick announced, his voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. Charges include unlawful timber harvesting, harboring fugitives, and operating without proper territorial licenses. The prosecution's case was weak from the beginning. Adelaide's testimony, delivered with theatrical outrage, painted Mercy as a dangerous vagrant who had corrupted an entire town before being taken in by an antisocial giant who flouted territorial law. Theodore added his version of events, carefully omitting any mention of tying Mercy to a tree while emphasizing her supposed moral failings. But when Ezra's attorney, a sharp, young lawyer named David Walsh who specialized in territorial resource law, began his defense, the prosecution's case crumbled like poorly mortared stone. "Your Honor," Walsh began, "my client operates under explicit territorial licenses obtained through proper channels over 3 years ago. Furthermore, his logging methods have been personally inspected and approved by territorial forestry officials." He produced a thick folder of documentation that Adelaide clearly hadn't expected to exist. License after license, inspection report after inspection report, all confirming that Ezra's operation not only met territorial requirements, but exceeded them in environmental responsibility. "As for the charge of harboring fugitives," Walsh continued, "Mrs. Mercy Blackwood has never been accused of any crime by any legitimate authority. The alleged vagrancy occurred when she was seeking honest employment while in a vulnerable condition. But she was an unmarried woman, pregnant and alone," Adelaide protested from the witness stand. "That speaks to moral corruption. It speaks to a young woman in difficult circumstances, Mrs. Whitmore. Circumstances made worse by the actions of your son and his associates." Walsh had been thorough in his preparation. Witness after witness took the stand to testify about the Blackwood family's character and standing in the community. Doc Henderson spoke about delivering Samuel and performing the marriage ceremony. The Henderson family testified about Mercy's gentle nature and Ezra's respected reputation among honest loggers. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source, Jacob Morrison, the boarding house owner whose wife had originally turned Mercy away. Morrison had apparently grown a conscience over the past 2 years, and his testimony about what really happened that night in the forest was devastating to the prosecution. "I was there when they tied her up," Morrison admitted, his voice barely audible. "Pregnant girl, scared out of her mind, begging us not to hurt her baby. Theodore said we were just going to scare her, make her leave town. But when we left her tied to that tree, we all knew what we were really doing." "And what was that, Mr. Morrison?" Walsh prompted. "We were trying to kill her. Maybe not with our own hands, but we knew that forest gets wolves and bears. We knew she couldn't survive tied up like that." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Magistrate Fitzpatrick gavelled for order while Adelaide's face went white with the realization that her son's actions were now public record. "Why are you coming forward now?" Walsh asked. Morrison glanced at Theodore, who was staring at his hands. "Because I haven't slept right since. Because I see my own daughter and think about what if it was her in that situation. And because—" he looked directly at Mercy, his eyes filled with regret. "Because that woman deserved better from all of us." The prosecution attempted to recover by calling character witnesses against Ezra, but this strategy backfired spectacularly. The men who testified had clearly been coached by Adelaide, and their accounts of the dangerous mountain hermit were contradicted by abundant evidence of Ezra's community involvement and business success. When Ezra himself finally took the stand, his quiet dignity and obvious devotion to his family made a powerful impression. He spoke simply and directly about finding Mercy, about their marriage, about building a life based on mutual respect and love. "I didn't save Mrs. Blackwood out of charity," he testified. "I saved her because leaving another human being to die was unthinkable. Everything that followed our marriage, our family, our life together, grew naturally from that foundation." "And," Samuel, Walsh asked, "how do you view your relationship with the child?" "Samuel is my son in every way that matters. I was there when he was born. I've been there for every milestone since, and I'll be there for whatever comes next. Blood doesn't make a father love and commitment do." The magistrate's decision was swift and decisive. All charges against the Blackwoods were dismissed, and the court issued a formal reprimand to Cedar Falls officials for their handling of the original incident. But Magistrate Fitzpatrick wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he announced, "this court finds that Mrs. Mercy Blackwood was the victim of attempted murder by persons acting under color of municipal authority. Criminal charges will be filed against Theodore Whitmore and his associates." Theodore shot to his feet, panic replacing his earlier sullenness. "You can't prove anything. It was just community protection." "Mr. Morrison's testimony proves otherwise." The magistrate replied coldly. "You deliberately abandoned a pregnant woman in circumstances designed to result in her death. That constitutes attempted murder under territorial law." Adelaide's wails of protest were drowned out by the gavel as Fitzpatrick ordered Theodore's immediate arrest. As deputies moved to take him into custody, the banker's son cast one last look of pure hatred at the Blackwood family. "This isn't justice," he snarled. "She's nothing but a whore who seduced a mountain savage." The words were his final mistake. Ezra rose from his seat like a force of nature awakening, his massive frame suddenly filling the courtroom with menace. But before he could move, Mercy placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let the law handle him," she said quietly. "He's not worth bloodying your hands." Ezra looked down at his wife, seeing the strength and dignity that had first drawn him to her. With visible effort, he settled back into his seat, though his eyes never left Theodore as the deputies led him away. "As you wish," he said. "But if he ever comes near our family again, ... He won't," Mercy replied with certainty. "Men like Theodore are only brave when they think there won't be consequences. Now that there are, he'll find other targets for his cruelty." The trial's aftermath brought unexpected benefits to the Blackwood family. News of their vindication spread throughout Montana Territory, along with accounts of Ezra's innovative forestry methods and their remarkable love story. Orders for Blackwood timber increased dramatically, and Ezra found himself consulted on forestry projects across the region. More importantly, their legal victory had established them as respected members of the territorial community. Samuel would grow up not as the bastard child of an unwed mother, but as the acknowledged son of successful, respectable parents. "We should celebrate," Mercy suggested as they prepared to return home from Helena. "What did you have in mind?" "A proper honeymoon." "We never had one, with Samuel arriving so soon after our marriage." Ezra grinned, the expression transforming his fierce features into something boyish and delighted. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you suggesting we take a vacation?" "I'm suggesting we take our son to see those California mountains you told me about. The railroad's finished now, and there are no pressing contracts until spring." The idea took root immediately. After years of struggle and responsibility, the notion of traveling together as a family, seeing new places and making new memories, appealed to all three of them. "Samuel's old enough to travel now," Ezra mused. "And California's supposed to be beautiful in winter." Then it settled. "Our first family adventure." As their wagon rolled homeward through the Montana wilderness, Samuel chattering excitedly about trains and mountains while his parents planned their California journey. The Blackwood family looked forward to a future bright with possibility. The girl who had once been tied to an oak tree, awaiting death in the Montana wilderness, now traveled as the respected wife of the territory's most successful independent logger. The giant who had chosen isolation over human contact now couldn't Imagine life without the laughter of his wife and son filling his mountain cabin. Together, they had built something unprecedented from the ashes of their separate tragedies. Family bound not by blood or convention, but by choice, sacrifice, and love that had grown stronger through every test it faced. The California Pacific Railroad car swayed gently as it wound through the Sierra Nevada mountains, carrying the Blackwood family toward adventures none of them could have imagined just 3 years earlier. Samuel, now an energetic 2-year-old, pressed his nose against the window with wonder, watching snow-capped peaks give way to rolling valleys dotted with orange groves and sprawling ranches. "Papa, big trees!" Samuel exclaimed, pointing at a grove of ancient oaks that lined a distant hillside. "Wait until you see the sequoias, little man," Ezra replied, lifting his son for a better view. "Trees so tall they disappear into the clouds." Mercy smiled at their excitement, her own anticipation building as familiar landmarks began appearing outside their window. She had studied California extensively during the long Montana winter, poring over guidebooks and maps in preparation for their honeymoon journey. What had begun as a simple vacation had evolved into something grander, a chance to explore business opportunities in the rapidly expanding western state. Sacramento bustled with energy as they disembarked from the train. The capital city had exploded in size since the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and construction projects stretched in every direction. Merchants hawked everything from Chinese silk to Mexican leather, while farmers brought produce from the fertile Central Valley to feed the growing population. Their hotel, the Golden State Palace, catered to successful business travelers rather than rough miners or cowboys. The clerk's eyes widened slightly when Ezra approached the registration desk, even by California standards. The giant Lumberjack was an impressive sight, but his manner remained professionally courteous. "The Blackwood family," Ezra announced. "We have reservations." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. The governor's suite, as requested. I trust everything will be to your satisfaction." Their rooms occupied an entire floor, with a parlor for conducting business, separate bedrooms for parents and child, and a dining area where they could entertain guests. Samuel immediately claimed the parlor's large windows as his favorite spot, watching the street activity below with fascination. "Why are there so many different people?" he asked, pointing at the diverse crowd of Chinese laborers, Mexican vaqueros, Eastern businessmen, and California natives that flowed past their hotel. "California draws people from everywhere," Mercy explained. "Everyone's looking for opportunities to build better lives." "Like we did in Montana?" "Exactly like that." Their first week in Sacramento was devoted to sightseeing and relaxation. They visited the state capitol building, where Samuel impressed legislators with his articulate questions about how laws were made. They toured the bustling port district, where goods from around the world arrived daily aboard ships and railroad cars. But the trip's turning point came when they met Charles Pemberton, owner of Pemberton Lumber Company and one of California's most successful timber barons. Pemberton had specifically requested a meeting after hearing about Ezra's revolutionary forestry methods from territorial officials in Montana. "Mr. Blackwood," Pemberton said as they shook hands in the hotel's elegant dining room, "your reputation precedes you. I've never heard of one man producing timber of such consistently high quality." "Quality comes from patience and respect for the resource," Ezra replied, settling carefully into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. Pemberton was a small, energetic man in his 50s, with the sharp eyes of someone who had built an empire through shrewd business decisions. He studied Ezra with obvious interest, clearly trying to reconcile the giant's fearsome appearance with his articulate manner and obvious intelligence. "I've seen samples of your work," Pemberton continued. "The grain structure, the seasoning, the precision of your cuts, it's unlike anything my mills produce. How do you achieve such consistency working alone?" Ezra explained his selective harvesting methods, his approach to aging timber naturally, and his philosophy of sustainable forestry. Pemberton listened with growing excitement, occasionally glancing at Mercy as if seeking confirmation that her husband was serious about his revolutionary ideas. "What if I told you," Pemberton said finally, "that I could offer you a partnership that would make you the wealthiest lumberjack in America?" "I'd say I'm already wealthy in the things that matter most," Ezra replied, glancing at Mercy and Samuel. "But I'd listen to your proposal." Pemberton's offer was staggering in scope. He wanted to establish a new division of his company based entirely on Ezra's sustainable methods, with Ezra as managing partner and 50% ownership. The operation would span thousands of acres of California forest, employing hundreds of workers trained in conservation techniques. "Think of the impact you could have," Pemberton urged. "Instead of training 8 apprentices in Montana, you could educate an entire generation of loggers in responsible forestry. Your methods could become the standard throughout the West." "And the financial arrangements?" Mercy asked, her practical nature asserting itself. "Starting capital of $100,000, plus 50% of all profits. Within 5 years, Mr. Blackwood would be worth more than most railroad barons." The sum was astronomical, more money than most people saw in lifetimes. Samuel, sensing the adults were discussing something important, climbed onto his father's lap and settled in to listen with grave attention. "I need time to consider this," Ezra said finally. "It's not a decision I can make lightly." "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Mr. Blackwood, opportunities like this don't come along often. California is the future of America, and forestry will be crucial to that future." That evening, in the privacy of their hotel suite, the Blackwood family faced their most significant decision since their marriage. The California offer represented security and influence beyond their wildest dreams, but it would mean leaving Montana permanently and embracing a lifestyle completely different from their current existence. "What do you think?" Mercy asked, bouncing Samuel on her knee while Ezra stared out at the Sacramento skyline. "I think it's tempting," Ezra admitted. "The chance to make a real difference, to prove that forestry doesn't have to mean environmental destruction, that appeals to me. But I wonder if we'd lose something essential in the process. The quiet life we've built, the connection to the land, the simplicity that brought us peace." Samuel began fussing, tired from the day's excitement. As Mercy prepared him for bed, she considered their options with the careful thought she brought to all important decisions. "There's another consideration," she said as she tucked Samuel into his makeshift crib. "What's best for him?" "Montana offers safety and privacy, but limited opportunities. California offers unlimited possibilities, but also complications we can't foresee." "He's too young to help decide," Ezra pointed out. "Is he? Watch how he responds to new experiences." Today at the Capitol, he was fascinated by everything: the people, the buildings, the energy. "He's not afraid of the unknown like we are." Their discussion was interrupted by urgent knocking at their suite door. Ezra opened it to find a hotel clerk accompanied by 2 men in territorial marshal badges. "Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm Marshal Williams. We need to speak with you about a situation that's developed back in Montana." The marshals explained that Theodore Whitmore had escaped from territorial custody during transport to the state penitentiary. He had murdered a guard in the process and was believed to be heading for Montana, possibly seeking revenge against the family whose testimony had led to his conviction. "How long ago?" Ezra asked, his relaxed vacation demeanor evaporating instantly. 3 days. We've wired authorities throughout the territory, but Theodore knows the backcountry better than most. Could take weeks to track him down. And you think he'll go after my family? Before his escape, Theodore made several threats against you and Mrs. Blackwood, specifically mentioned settling scores and finishing what was started. We have to take those threats seriously. Mercy felt ice forming in her stomach. Our cabin he knows where we live. We'll post guards at your property, Marshal Williams assured her. But frankly, Mr. Blackwood, you might want to consider extending your California visit until we have Theodore back in custody. No, Ezra said. Flatly, I won't run from a coward like Theodore Whitmore. Besides, our home is our responsibility to protect. Ezra, Mercy said carefully, maybe we should consider the marshal's suggestion. Samuel's safety comes first. Samuel's safety is exactly why we need to go home. That cabin is built like a fortress. I know every inch of the surrounding forest. And Theodore's never faced me on ground of my choosing. The discussion continued late into the night, with practical concerns warring against protective instincts. Finally, they reached a compromise. They would return to Montana immediately, but Samuel would stay in California with the Henderson family, who had connections in Sacramento and could ensure his safety until the threat was eliminated. The separation was heart-wrenching. Samuel couldn't understand why his parents were leaving without him, and his tears at the Sacramento train station nearly broke Mercy's resolve. "Papa, come back," he sobbed, clinging to Ezra's massive neck. "Soon, little man, very soon. You be good for Dr. Henderson and his wife. Promise?" "I promise. And when we come back, we'll bring you something special from the big trees." The journey back to Montana passed in tense silence. Both parents were lost in their own thoughts, Mercy worrying about Samuel despite knowing he was safe with the Hendersons, Ezra planning defensive strategies and considering how best to end the Theodore threat permanently. Their cabin stood, untouched. When they arrived, but Ezra's experienced eye immediately detected signs of surveillance. Broken twigs, disturbed earth, footprints that didn't belong, all evidence that someone had been watching their home during their absence. "He's here," Ezra said grimly, checking his rifle and axe with professional thoroughness. "Probably Ben. Waiting for days. How do you want to handle this?" Carefully. "Theodore's desperate now, which makes him more dangerous than before, but he's also alone, and this is my territory." They established a defensive routine, with Mercy handling indoor preparations while Ezra secured the perimeter. Trip wires were strung at strategic points, supplies were moved to interior rooms, and escape routes were planned in case the situation deteriorated beyond control. Theodore made his move on the third night, approaching the cabin under cover of darkness with the stealth of someone who had spent weeks planning his revenge. But he had underestimated both Ezra's woodcraft and his determination to protect his family. The first trip wire alerted them to his presence while he was still 50 yards from the cabin. The second, triggered as he approached the porch, brought Ezra silently out the back door while Mercy remained hidden inside with the rifle. "Theodore," Ezra called softly from the shadows, "I know you're here. Why don't you come out and face me like the man you pretend to be? Where's the whore?" Theodore's voice came from behind a large pine tree, slurred with alcohol and madness. "I've got something for her. My wife is somewhere you'll never reach her. But I'm right here, ready to finish what you started." Theodore emerged from concealment, and even in the moonlight, Ezra could see that prison and desperate flight had changed him. The banker's son was thinner, wilder, with the dangerous gleam of someone who had lost everything and blamed others for his downfall. "You ruined my life," Theodore snarled, raising a pistol with shaking hands. "My family's reputation, my standing in the community, all destroyed because of that slut you married." "Your life was ruined by your own choices," Ezra replied, moving closer with the patient stalking of a predator. "Blaming others for your failures doesn't change that. She seduced you, turned you against decent people. You were supposed to be a hermit, living alone in the mountains. Then she showed up and corrupted everything." Ezra laughed, the sound echoing through the forest. "Corrupted? Theodore, you have no idea what you're talking about. Mercy saved me from loneliness and gave me purpose. Samuel gave me a future worth working toward. They didn't corrupt my life, they completed it. The words enraged Theodore beyond rational thought. He fired wildly, the shot going wide and splintering bark from a nearby tree. Before he could fire again, Ezra was on him, moving with speed. That belied his massive size. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Theodore's desperation was no match for Ezra's controlled fury and overwhelming physical advantage. Within moments, the banker's son was disarmed and pinned against the ground, Ezra's enormous hand around his throat. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't end this right here," Ezra growled, his voice barely human. Theodore gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror as he finally faced the full consequences of his actions. "Please, I didn't mean the gun went off by accident. Like tying Mercy to a tree was an accident. Like leaving her to die was an accident. I was drunk, scared. My mother said she was dangerous. Your mother's a bitter old woman, and you're a coward who hides behind her influence. But you made one mistake tonight that I can't forgive." "What? You threatened my wife in my home. That's not something I can let stand." Ezra's grip tightened, and for a moment, Theodore's life hung by the thinnest thread. But then Mercy's voice called from the cabin doorway. "Ezra, stop. He's not worth becoming a murderer." The words penetrated Ezra's rage, reminding him of who he was and what he stood to lose. With visible effort, he released Theodore, who collapsed gasping in the pine needles. "Marshal Williams will be here by morning," Mercy continued, stepping onto the porch with the rifle trained on Theodore. "I sent word as soon as we spotted him. He can face justice the proper way." Theodore attempted to crawl away, but Ezra's boot on his back stopped him immediately. "You're staying right here until the marshal arrives. And Theodore, if you ever threaten my family again, in any way, I won't be so merciful next time." The remainder of the night passed without incident, with Theodore bound securely and guarded while they waited for official law enforcement. When Marshal Williams arrived with a full posse at dawn, he found the situation well in hand and the escaped prisoner ready for transport. Attempted murder, escape from custody, killing a guard. The marshal recited as his men loaded Theodore into a reinforced wagon. "He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, assuming they don't hang him." "Good," Ezra said without sympathy. "Some people can't be redeemed. What about his mother?" Mercy asked. "Adelaide's lost her only son. Adelaide's actions helped create the monster her son became," Marshal Williams replied. "She have to live with that knowledge." As the law enforcement party disappeared down the mountain trail, taking Theodore Whitmore out of their lives forever, the Blackwood family finally felt free to embrace their future without shadows from the past. "California?" Ezra asked, putting his arm around Mercy's shoulders. "California," she agreed. "Let's go collect our son and start our new adventure." The journey back to Sacramento was markedly different from their tense departure. Free from the threat of Theodore's revenge, they could appreciate the changing landscape and anticipate reunion with Samuel. When they finally reached the Henderson house where their son was staying, the boy's delighted squeals could be heard throughout the neighborhood. "Mama! Papa!" Samuel launched himself from Martha Henderson's arms into his father's embrace, chattering excitedly about trains and horses and all the wonders he had discovered during their brief separation. "Did you miss us?" Mercy asked, covering his face with kisses. "Missed lots, but Mrs. Martha made cookies." The reunion was joyful but brief. Charles Pemberton had been waiting for their return, eager to finalize the partnership agreement that would transform both their lives and the California timber industry. "I've prepared everything," Pemberton announced over dinner at Sacramento's finest restaurant. "Land acquisitions, worker housing, mill construction, all ready to begin as soon as you give the word. And our concerns about maintaining sustainable practices?" Ezra asked. "Written into every contract. No clear cutting, no harvesting of young growth, mandatory reforestation of all logged areas." Your methods will be company policy, enforced at every level. Mercy studied the detailed contracts while Samuel entertained himself with toy horses Pemberton had thoughtfully provided. The financial projections were staggering. Within a decade, the Blackwood-Pemberton partnership could be worth millions. There's one additional consideration, Pemberton added carefully. Political influence. California is heading toward statehood, and the man who establishes the standard for responsible resource management will have considerable say in how that development proceeds. You're talking about Samuel's future, Mercy realized. Exactly. Your son could grow up as one of the most influential men in the American West, with the resources and connections to shape an entire region's development. That night, in their hotel suite overlooking the Sacramento River, the Blackwood family held their most important family meeting yet. Samuel, now old enough to express opinions even if he couldn't fully understand the implications, was included in the discussion. "Samuel, how do you like California?" Mercy asked. "Lots of trains and oranges." "And the man with the funny hat." Samuel's enthusiasm was boundless, as usual. "Would you like to live here?" Samuel considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "With Papa and Mama?" "Of course with Papa and Mama. And horses?" "There would definitely be horses," Ezra confirmed, suppressing a smile. "Then yes, live here." The adults exchanged glances over Samuel's head. Their son's endorsement wasn't the deciding factor, but it removed one significant concern from their deliberations. "I keep thinking about that girl tied to the tree," Mercy said quietly after Samuel had fallen asleep. "How hopeless everything seemed. How certain I was that my story would end in that forest. What about her? If someone had told her that 3 years later she'd be sitting in the finest hotel in California, married to the man she loved, with a beautiful son and opportunities beyond imagination, she never would have believed it. Life has a way of surprising us, exactly. And I think maybe it's time to stop being afraid of those surprises. We've proven we can handle whatever comes our way." Ezra nodded slowly. "The partnership with Pemberton would give us resources to help other people the way Doc Henderson and his wife helped us. We could establish funds for unmarried mothers, create jobs for men willing to learn sustainable logging, maybe even build schools in areas that don't have them." "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about legacy. Not just financial success, but the kind of impact we want to have on the world Samuel will inherit." The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. They would accept Pemberton's partnership, but with modifications that reflected their values and priorities. Rather than simply maximizing profit, the Blackwood-Pemberton operation would serve as a model for responsible development throughout the West. The signing ceremony took place in Pemberton's Sacramento offices, with newspaper reporters and territorial officials in attendance. The partnership agreement made headlines throughout California and beyond, establishing Ezra as the face of a new approach to resource management. The Blackwood method, as journalists quickly dubbed it, represented a radical departure from the clear-cutting practices that had devastated forests from Maine to Oregon. By demonstrating that sustainable logging could be more profitable than destructive harvesting, Ezra hoped to revolutionize an entire industry. "We're not just cutting trees," he explained to a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle. "We're stewarding forests for future generations. My son will inherit timber lands that are more productive than when we started, not scarred wastelands that will take centuries to recover." The interview made national news, with Eastern newspapers picking up the story of the Montana giant who had married an orphan and revolutionized Western forestry. Letters began arriving from across the country, some praising their innovative approach, others criticizing what conservative voices called interference with free enterprise. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. A letter arrived from Kansas, written in the careful script of an elderly woman who had known Ezra's family years before. "My dear Ezra," the letter began, "I was your mother's closest friend, and I've followed your remarkable story through the newspapers with great joy. Elizabeth would be so proud of the man you've become and the family you've built. Your sister Sarah's spirit lives on in the love you've shown to Mercy and Samuel." The letter went on to describe memories of Ezra's childhood, his parents' dreams for their children, and Sarah's hopes for her unborn child. It painted a picture of a family bound by love and ambition, destroyed by circumstances but somehow restored through Ezra's courage and compassion. "She knew about Sarah?" Mercy asked, reading over Ezra's shoulder. "They were best friends. Sarah wrote to her regularly until—" Ezra's voice trailed off, but his expression was peaceful rather than pained. It's good to know someone remembers them the way they really were. As autumn settled over Northern California, the Blackwood family established themselves in a magnificent house overlooking the American River. The property included stables for their growing collection of horses, gardens where Mercy could experiment with California's year-round growing season, and workshops where Ezra could train his expanding workforce. Samuel adapted to their new life with the resilience of childhood, making friends among the children of Ezra's workers and discovering endless fascination in the diverse wildlife of California forests. His vocabulary expanded to include Spanish phrases learned from the Mexican vaqueros and Chinese expressions picked up from the railroad workers who sometimes visited their father. "He's going to grow up completely different from either of us," Mercy observed one evening, watching Samuel attempt to teach their dog to shake hands in 3 different languages. "Better than either of us," Ezra corrected. "He'll have opportunities we never dreamed of, but he'll also have the values we've taught him. And if he chooses a completely different path, what if he becomes a doctor or a lawyer instead of following in your footsteps? Then he'll be the finest doctor or lawyer in California," Ezra replied without hesitation. "Our job isn't to choose his future, it's to give him the tools to choose it himself." The Blackwood-Pemberton Partnership's first major project was the construction of a model logging community in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Unlike the rough camps that typically housed timber workers, this settlement featured permanent homes, a school, a church, and facilities that encouraged families to settle, rather than simply endure harsh working conditions. "Revolutionary thinking," Pemberton admitted as they toured the completed community. "Most companies treat workers as disposable. You're creating a workforce with genuine investment in the operation's success. Happy workers are productive workers." Ezra replied, watching his men demonstrate selective cutting techniques to a group of visitors from Oregon Territory. "Treat people well, and they'll give you their best effort." The model was already attracting attention from other industries. Mining companies were inquiring about adapting Ezra's worker-centered approach to their operations, while railroad barons wanted to understand how sustainable resource management could be made profitable. But success brought new challenges. Competitors, who resented the Blackwood method's growing influence, began spreading rumors about unfair business practices and political corruption. Environmental activists, ironically, criticized Ezra for legitimizing logging operations they believed should be stopped entirely. "You can't please everyone," Mercy pointed out during one of their evening strategy sessions. "The important thing is staying true to our principles." Agreed, but we need to be prepared for more organized opposition. Success makes enemies, especially when it challenges established ways of doing business. The threat materialized sooner than expected, but from a direction they hadn't anticipated. Rather than business rivals or political opponents, their next challenge came from an entirely unexpected source: William Hayes, the traveling merchant who had fathered Samuel and abandoned Mercy years earlier. Hayes had apparently followed their story through newspaper accounts and decided that his son's inheritance was worth claiming. His lawyer's letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, demanding paternity rights, financial compensation, and a share in the Blackwood-Pemberton partnership. He wants what? Mercy asked, reading the legal document with growing disbelief. Half of everything, plus custody rights to Samuel, Ezra said grimly. Claims that since he's the biological father, he has legal standing to challenge our marriage and my adoption of Samuel. After abandoning us when I needed him most? The law doesn't always account for moral considerations. Biological paternity carries weight regardless of circumstances. The legal challenge threatened everything they had built. California law was unclear about adoption rights in cases involving unwed mothers and absent biological fathers, and Hayes had hired attorneys skilled in exploiting such ambiguities. But the Blackwood family had learned important lessons about facing adversity together. Whatever Hayes thought he could take from them, he was about to discover that some bonds can't be broken by legal documents or financial pressure. The real war for their family's future was about to begin. The courtroom in San Francisco was packed beyond capacity as California's most sensational custody case reached its climax. William Hayes, now clean-shaven and dressed in expensive Eastern clothes, sat confidently beside his high-priced attorneys. Across the aisle, the Blackwood family presented a united front, Ezra's massive frame imposing even in formal wear, Mercy radiating quiet dignity, and 3-year-old Samuel unconsciously charming everyone within sight. The case had captured national attention, with newspapers from New York to Los Angeles following every development. At stake was more than just one family's future. The legal precedent would affect adoption rights, parental claims, and the definition of family itself throughout the expanding West. Hayes took the stand first, his testimony carefully crafted to portray himself as a reformed man seeking to reconnect with his son. He spoke eloquently about discovering Samuel's existence through newspaper accounts, his desire to provide proper education and opportunities, and his regret over past mistakes. I was young and foolish when I left Miss Caldwell, he admitted, with practiced contrition. I've spent years building a successful business in Denver, preparing to support the family I didn't know I had. His attorney produced financial documents showing Hayes's considerable wealth from silver mining investments. Bank statements, property deeds, and business contracts painted a picture of a man who could provide material advantages the Blackwoods couldn't match. Mr. Hayes can offer young Samuel educational opportunities at the finest Eastern schools, the lawyer argued. Private tutors, European travel, entry into the highest levels of society. Can a Montana lumberjack, however well-intentioned, provide such advantages? When Ezra's turn came to testify, he spoke with the same quiet honesty that had served him throughout his life. He described finding Mercy tied to the tree, delivering Samuel during the blizzard, and the gradual development of their family bonds. I didn't become Samuel's father because of biology, Ezra said, his deep voice carrying easily through the courtroom. I became his father by being there for every milestone, every fever, every moment of joy and discovery. Hayes provided genetic material. I provided love, protection, and guidance. But surely you recognize that blood relationships carry special significance? Hayes's attorney pressed. Blood means nothing without commitment. I've seen biological fathers abandon their children, and I've seen adopted children flourish with parents who chose to love them. Samuel knows who his real father is. The courtroom stirred as Samuel himself was called as a witness, highly unusual for such a young child. But Judge Morrison had determined that the boy's own preferences should be considered. Samuel climbed confidently into the witness chair, though his feet didn't reach the floor. The bailiff had provided a booster seat and a cup of water, treating the 3-year-old with the same dignity afforded adult witnesses. Samuel, Judge Morrison said gently, do you know why you're here today? Papa Ezra says there's a man who wants to take me away, Samuel replied with startling clarity. Are you afraid? No, Papa Ezra wouldn't let anyone hurt me. What about the man over there? The judge indicated Hayes. Do you know who he is? Samuel looked at Hayes with the frank curiosity of childhood, showing no recognition or fear. He looks sad, the boy observed. He says he's your father. What do you think about that? Samuel's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. Papa's right there, he said, pointing at Ezra. That man's just a stranger. Hayes's face crumpled at the words, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his legal strategy. This wasn't just about claiming an inheritance or establishing paternal rights. It was about a child who genuinely didn't know him and didn't want to. Samuel, Judge Morrison continued, if you had to choose where to live, what would you choose? With Mama and Papa in our house with the big trees, and our dog Rex, and my horses, and my workshop where Papa teaches me about wood. Is there anywhere else you'd like to live? Samuel considered this seriously, then shook his head. Home is with my family. The judge dismissed Samuel with obvious reluctance. The boy's testimony had been more compelling than hours of legal arguments. As Ezra lifted his son down from the witness chair, Samuel whispered loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "Did I do good, Papa? You did perfect, little man." Judge Morrison's decision came after 3 days of deliberation. When court reconvened, the gallery was even more crowded, with standing room at a premium and reporters scribbling furiously. This case forces us to examine fundamental questions about the nature of family and parenthood, the judge began. Is a father defined by biological contribution or by daily commitment? Does financial advantage outweigh emotional security? Should legal technicalities supersede a child's clearly expressed preferences? He reviewed the evidence methodically, Hayes's biological claim versus Ezra's practical fatherhood, financial resources versus emotional bonds, legal rights versus moral obligations. After careful consideration, Judge Morrison announced, "This court finds that the best interest of the child must supersede all other considerations." Samuel Blackwood is clearly thriving in his current environment, with parents who have demonstrated unwavering commitment to his welfare. Hayes half rose from his seat, hope flickering in his eyes. However, the judge continued, this court also recognizes that Mr. Hayes has legitimate claims that cannot be entirely dismissed. Therefore, this court orders the following arrangement... The compromise was elegant in its fairness. Hayes would be granted visitation rights 1 month each summer until Samuel reached 18, but custody would remain permanently with the Blackwoods. Additionally, Hayes would establish a trust fund for Samuel's education, while the Blackwoods retained full authority over the boy's upbringing and daily care. This arrangement ensures that Samuel benefits from both his biological heritage and his chosen family, Judge Morrison explained. It also establishes important precedents for similar cases throughout the expanding territories. Hayes's reaction was mixed disappointment at not gaining full custody, but relief at securing some connection to his son. As the courtroom cleared, he approached the Blackwood family with obvious uncertainty. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "I never intended to cause pain. When I left Montana years ago, I didn't know about the pregnancy." "But you knew about the promises you made," Mercy replied evenly. "You knew I trusted you." Hayes nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I was a different person then. Selfish, irresponsible. Success changed me, but by then it was too late to undo the damage." "It's not too late to do better going forward," Ezra said, his tone neutral but not hostile. "Samuel could benefit from knowing his biological heritage, provided you remember that we're his parents. I understand. And I want you to know I'm grateful he found you, both of you. He's clearly loved and well cared for." The legal victory launched the Blackwood family into a new phase of their remarkable journey. The partnership with Pemberton flourished beyond all projections, with the sustainable logging model being adopted by companies throughout the West. Ezra's influence on forestry policy helped shape California's approach to statehood, ensuring that environmental protection would be written into the state constitution. Mercy established the Blackwood Foundation, dedicated to helping unmarried mothers and abandoned children throughout the territories. Her own experience provided insight into the specific needs of vulnerable women, and the Foundation's innovative programs became models for social welfare across America. Samuel grew into a confident, intelligent boy who moved easily between worlds equally, comfortable in the forest with his father's logging crews and in Sacramento's political circles where his mother advocated for social reform. His summers with William Hayes provided exposure to business and mining, but he always returned home with obvious relief and joy. "Papa, I learned about silver mining, but I like trees better," he announced after his first visit with Hayes at age 6. "Why is that?" Ezra asked, genuinely curious about his son's reasoning. "Trees grow back. Uncle William digs holes that stay empty forever." The wisdom in such simple observations never ceased to amaze his parents. Samuel possessed both Mercy's compassion and Ezra's practical intelligence, combined with an innate understanding of natural systems that suggested he would indeed carry on his father's conservation legacy. On Samuel's 10th birthday, the family returned to Montana for the first time since their move to California. The cabin that had sheltered them through their early years together still stood exactly as they had left it, maintained by Ezra's former apprentices who had continued operating a smaller timber business in the area. "This is where I was born?" Samuel asked, exploring the rooms that had been his first home. "Right upstairs," Mercy confirmed. "During the worst blizzard your father had ever seen." Samuel examined everything with intense curiosity. The crib Ezra had crafted, the chair where Mercy had nursed him, the workshop where his first toys had been made. But it was the oak tree in the forest that captured his attention most completely. "Mama was tied here?" he asked, running his small hands over the bark where rope marks were still faintly visible. "Yes," Mercy said simply. "This is where our story really began, because Papa saved you. Because your father saw someone who needed help and chose to act with kindness instead of indifference." Samuel studied the massive tree thoughtfully. "If Papa hadn't found you, I wouldn't exist. You might have existed, but you wouldn't be you. Everything that makes you special comes from the love and choices that followed that night." The family spent a week in Montana, visiting old friends and showing Samuel the wilderness that had shaped his parents' early relationship. But their future clearly lay in California, where their influence continued growing and their impact on Western development expanded. 20 years later, Samuel Blackwood would be elected as California's youngest governor, running on a platform of sustainable development and social justice that reflected the values his parents had instilled. His inaugural address would reference the oak tree where his mother had once been tied, describing it as a symbol of how strength could grow from the deepest adversity, but that political triumph lay in the distant future. For now, as the family prepared to return to their California life, they represented something unprecedented in American society, a family that had chosen each other across lines of blood, circumstance, and social convention, proving that love and commitment could overcome any obstacle. The girl who had once awaited death in a Montana forest now shaped policy in California's capital. The giant who had chosen isolation now led an industry toward environmental responsibility. The child born from tragedy had become the bridge between worlds, equally comfortable with loggers and legislators, miners and conservationists. As their train pulled away from Montana's mountain peaks for the final time, carrying them toward a future bright with promise and possibility, the Blackwood family looked ahead with confidence earned through surviving every test life had offered. They had started as strangers brought together by desperation and chance. They had become a family bound by choice, sustained by love, and strengthened by shared purpose. Whatever challenges awaited them in the years ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else together, with courage and with unwavering faith in the power of human decency to triumph over cruelty. The oak tree still stands in that Montana forest. Its rope scars long since healed over, but never forgotten. Sometimes, travelers passing through will pause beneath its ancient branches, perhaps sensing the echo of the extraordinary love story that began there on a cold November night when a pregnant orphan prayed for salvation and a lonely giant chose compassion over indifference. Their story proves that mercy given freely returns multiplied, that families can be built from the most unlikely materials, and that true strength lies not in the power to harm, but in the courage to heal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.